Hello! In this video I want to show you two, so to say, ancient mold making technologies. One of them is going to be a type of mold which I am going to use many times. I will press clay into it and have many of these. This one is going to be a waste mold. Waste mold is a type of mold which is used only once. I make a two-piece mold. After I separate that two-piece mold and coat it with some sort of separator, I will pour the plaster in and destroy the mold. I will be left with this button plaster. This one is going to be somewhat similar to these. This is a Medusa relief I have posted recently, and this is Sphinx relief. And the thing with these two is that I squeeze clay into this and get this out and have it dry. After some time I can have it fired at some 1000 degrees Celsius, and I need this to be very durable because I'm going to need many of these tiles, let's say 10 of those. I want it to be really strong, so that's why I used hemp fiber, which I am going to be using on this example I am making on both sides. One of each is going to be really sufficient. In this relief I used 20 of these little hemp nests. These are a bit really simple, small caricatures, so to say. This one is very smooth and simple, and it's going to be easy to take it out of the mold and make many of these. The bubbly one is going to be used for waste mold, and maybe I will be able to use some of these leftovers from the mold I'm going to be destroying. More or less these are all the tools I'm using. I always save soda cans. I wash them and I store them and then I cut them. I will use them as dividers for the two parts of the mold. For mixing plaster I use this plastic container, which is very flexible, so I can use it many times. And I use this glove, just one, because I feel it's more practical to me. And after every use I just squish it a bit. It takes all the plaster residue off, and I just wash it a bit. It reduces plastic waste and it's still just as good. I start by outlining where the seam is going to be. This one, which is going to be a waste mold, I can divide as I would usually divide a large life-size portrait. So this back is going to be a little bit smaller because I'm going to open that one first, and then I'm going to pull out the clay from this one. It's usually done because there's a construction inside and you cannot really maneuver around it, so you just want to set it free somewhere where it's going to be easy to pull this part off and just dig through slowly. I'm just going to shape it a bit so it's very soft on all sides. Many sculptors use much thicker versions of these, but be it a life-size portrait or a figure or something, but I use these because they still do the job and they are very subtle, so the seam is not very thick. It's almost not noticeable and it's really easy to retouch later. Usually when making a cast where you want to take as many models as you can, you will make a silicone layer first and then plaster layer, which is going to hold the silicone in the place, and you just pour the plaster in. But this one is going to be a bit more just a technique that's been used for thousands of years. and it's just plaster over this, and it's going to be very dry every time I'm using it. I'm going to have those two parts. I lay them down, fill each of them with a thin layer of clay, get them together, merge it together, and then I separate it, and I have a like this sculpture but empty, actually hollow inside, and then I can just leave it to dry and fire it. However, this one, it's just a pity to use silicone for something you just need once. That's why waste mold is being used. Waste mold can be a bit complicated if you are doing it for the first time. So here I don't have a lot of water, it's just this much, and it's enough to make the first layer of both of these sculptures. I am adding as long as there is some floating. It's almost not floating anywhere anymore, so I can mix it now. It shouldn't be too densely mixed, otherwise it's going to harden very, very soon. This is the ideal density. You have just a couple of minutes to work with plaster before it goes hard. And it's really important to clean the dividers the whole time. They have to be visible in the end of the process. So for this one we use hemp fiber right away and shape it something like this. Some plaster through it. And then just thin layer on the back. Another hemp fiber nest. Pull the plaster all the way to these dividers. It has to be reaching the dividers from both sides. So when you divide these two sides, you know where they come back together. Make sure that the entire surface of your sculpture has the same amount of plaster on it. This one is supposed to be used many times, although I don't think that I will be using it many times, since these two sculptures are just simplified sketches for this video. So now we're just gonna look for dividers. I found them. This is the easiest way to scrape off plaster, and I just want both of these molds to be soft. So I'm just going to use the sponge while the plaster is still somewhat easy to work with. Before continuing with new layer of plaster on this one, you may want to get the first layer wet, as it's sort of getting dry, and if you are applying a new layer on dry surface, this plaster, the first layer, may be taking the moisture from the second layer and speed up the natural process of the plaster. So it's better to get it a bit wet. So just checking on the dividers. It doesn't have to be smooth like this one, since this one is going to be used many times, and this one is just going to be used once actually. It's going to be destroyed later. Plaster will get warm as you work with it. When you are done, it gets slowly cold. Some 15 minutes later, it is ready to open. Okay, separating. I slightly rotate it. These can be used again. I'm doing this carefully as I don't want to get the clay too dirty with the plaster. Same procedure. I just have to be really gentle because this is a waste mold and it's somewhat thinner. So we have two molds. First I'm going to work on waste mold and prepare it. It's going to take longer time. This one would preferably need to be dry. That would take maybe 2 days. Because if I want to squeeze clay in it, it has to be dry so it takes out the moisture. So it's easier to pull it apart. This one, I am pouring the plaster in, which means when I want to separate it, I have to make sure that plaster cast doesn't stick to plaster mold. Which is why I have prepared this. This is a dishwashing soap. You can actually use any hand washing soap. Wet the molds before adding soap. Tap in extra if there's any water floating. Now allow the plaster to dry a bit. Now I have some time to retouch. This one is going to be hollow, so I will need some hemp nests. It's always good to have a couple of hemp nests around. I pour in the first layer. And leave it to harden a bit. The mold has been cold for at least 10 minutes now, so we're going to try. Most of the time this process is really easy. A while ago I was making a cast of a portrait which was going off on its own. The sculpture from the waste mold is finished, and this is before retouching. Retouching isn't always necessary, but sometimes the edges from the seam are visible. In this case I'm not going to retouch it, I'm just going to leave it as it is. I'm not going to get clay models out of this mold before morning because it's still far from dry. It is morning and the second mold is not as moist as it was the last night, and it can now be used for making a clay model out of it. I am using fresh clay which hasn't been used for making a mold or anything. It's clean out of the package, and I will be using just a little bit to make one model. I use fishing string to cut clay. This will be sufficient, I think. Best way to go about this if you want this really smooth and as the mold is. This is what I do first. Put one big chunk, and from it I spread onward. That will prevent any gaps from appearing between the chunks of clay. I don't want to make it too thick, so instead I can make this net, which I merge well. These edges are standing out a little bit, and I'm just going to do this, so they are not towards outside but towards inside. So when I squeeze the other part of the mold together with it, it's all going to go inside but blend together. Let's say you want some sort of effect with these gaps being visible, so we can do this. I add one chunk next to another. I don't start here and bring it down so it's seamless, but I intentionally place it next one another. So it's just going to have a gap here. Both sides are ready, and now I just want to wet the edges so they blend in together well. I don't want to wet this part as I need it to be a little dry, not really, and firm. There are better ways to do this, but I'm just going to do it this way. It's going to be just as good. This mold is made firm, so it can take some violence. It has hemp fiber on both sides. It's pretty dry, so it's okay. Okay, it's gapless on this side. Okay, one is done. I want to remove some plaster from here, so now I just do a bit of this, although I should have done it while the mold was still on it. I'm going slowly because I don't want to deform it. And there it is. Before I go on, I want to clean the mold. None of these have been retouched. This technique always means that it's going to need some retouching, but it's really minimal and very easy to do. What's really nice about this type of mold for clay is that you can make many versions of this, but with each having minimal changes, variations. So that's it. It's been retouched in just 2 minutes. These are the leftovers. They contain some chunks of plaster. I can use them as just it's not... I'm just going to put them together with the clay I usually use just for making molds and not for firing. They appeared on surface because they just collected some plaster dust from the mold, but I don't want to use it for firing because it can cause the sculpture to break in the kiln, because the clay shrinks in size when it is getting dry. And it shrinks, for example, from 3 to 6%, depends. Some clays shrink even to up to 10% while getting dry and firing. Since it shrinks in size, the trapped chunks of plaster will remain the same size and they will just cause the clay to break around them. So it's always best to, like these on the surface really won't matter, but it's always best to use clay as fresh as possible when making pottery or something that's going to be fired. Since I was adding one chunk next to another of clay in the process, I assumed that it would leave these gaps. I really like them, so I'm going to leave them like this. Both of these models are going to wait for 5 days. The clay one is going to wait for 5 days to dry. Slowly I will cover it with a plastic bag so it can dry really slowly. I want to leave airflow, but I just don't want it to dry too quickly because it can separate where the seam was. This one is going to wait for a couple of days as well before I paint it. When drying, especially if you are using acrylic paint, you may want to have it really dry, because otherwise the plaster is going to be releasing its moisture and it's going to be discarding the paint off it. It won't stick, leaving marks on your fingers for even 3 days, 5 days, especially if it's a heavy paint. So when it's really dry, you can paint it with anything and it will get dry quickly because it will be absorbing the moisture from the paint. Plaster cannot be left outside, although I prefer to coat it with a transparent varnish which is water-based. I like to do it because it gives it just a little bit of shine. It doesn't look like a plaster cast. And since I really like sculptures that are painted black, they collect dust, it's really visible, so I like to wipe it from time to time. Those water-based varnishes can be used on wood as well. They get dry within 10 minutes, and if you want to mix them with paint, for example acrylic paint, not to have just a glassy layer over this paint, but to make it look like a solid, shiny material, they are really ideal for that. I hope this video inspired you to try creating something of your own. These materials are easily accessible. I used kilogram of plaster and the cost of it is, in dollars, I would say under $1. I used hemp fiber, which can be found in stores with plumbing equipment, and it's really cheap. For making models you can buy clay or plasticine in any art shop, although I buy big blocks of good quality clay. I used just a few tools, half of soda can, for making both of these. The process itself takes some patience for a beginner, but going slowly and cleaning after every step does the work for you. Thank you for watching and I hope this helps.